Okay, we're recording?
Yes.
We're good. All right, thanks. My name's Mark Sindoni. This is my friend Guy LaRosa. So we're talking about the story of Scripture, and in part of this, Guy, this is an exam requirement in order to start from Genesis all the way to Revelation. And for me to be able to just tell that story seamlessly through the entire content. So thanks for taking the time with me in order to go through it, and we'll see how it goes here. The book of the Bible is really hard for a lot of people to get into, to see it chronologically from start to finish. So what I want to do is break it down into sections that you can see the story from the very beginning to the end in a seamless approach. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about the structure. And the way that the structure holds up is that we have the English Bible is broken into the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Old Testament is really, the easiest way to do it is for me to kind of go through some numbers. And those numbers are 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. So the first 5 books are the Pentateuch, or some say it's the Book of Moses, or the Torah, as it's known in the Jewish religion. The next series of books, the 12, is the books of history. And this is an important part. And we're going to get back to the books of history, but that's theological history. Mm-hmm. And then we have 5 books of poetry. And then we have 5 books of the prophets and 12 books of prophecy. So those 2 books, the only difference between those 2 sections is we have the minor and then the major. The minor prophecies and the major prophets. And because they're different in size is the only reason why they differentiate those. So that comprises, that 512, 5512 is the Old Testament. So when we go to the New Testament is comprised of a series of books, and that is 4, 1, 21, 1. So the first 4 are the gospel, and those are probably the most known by Christians. It basically tells the story of Jesus. And then it goes into 1 book of history. It's the 4-1, 1 book of history. When I say history, like I said on the Old Testament, it's theological history. And then 21, and that's 21 books or letters, or what we call the epistles, fancy word for letters. And then the final 1 book is a prophecy, which is Revelation. And what we're going to do is we're going to see the common thread through all of this. Now, what's interesting, I'm going to go back into the Old Testament. And when we said it was 5, 12, 5, 5, 12, that 5, 5, 12 poetry, the minor and major prophets, we can pick all those up and actually drop them into the history side, those 12 books. Because those scriptures are written during the time of history, and they can be overlaid in history for that time. So that gives us the overall structure of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so now we'll go from Genesis to Revelation. So let's start from the beginning of creation. So we have a creator, God, and he created all things. And if we look at the very beginning of Genesis, the book starts out that God created the heavens, he created the earth, the oceans, the animals, all of wildlife and nature that we see. And on the 6th day, he created man. And when he created everything before man, he said it was good. But when he created man in his own image, he said it was very good. And on the 7th day, he rested. And he didn't rest because he was tired, he was burdened. He rested because he was pleased. He was well pleased with what he created. So as Genesis starts to move forward with creation of man, we see that Adam and Eve, the man and the woman that he created, were in the garden. And the garden was beautiful. It was peace. It was a very peaceful state. Shalom, the word for peace. And it was very good. It was an oasis. It was perfection. It was paradise. And they were in relationship with God. And they were in strong unison and unity with one another and with God. And in enter the problem. Well, see, when God placed Adam and Eve in the Bible, in the Garden of Eden, he only gave them one rule, and that was not to eat of the fruit of good and evil, the tree of good and evil. And this is where the problem entered in, is when Eve and Adam were at the tree, there was a serpent. And in enters the serpent. There's not a lot of knowledge of where the serpent came from, or what the status was, or why he was there. But he entered in, and a unique thing about the serpent is that he talked. And he spoke to Adam and Eve. And he was speaking specifically to Eve. And he was a crafty serpent. And he really took the words of God and twisted them a little bit. And said, surely you will not die if you touch the tree of good and evil. And so he continued to twist and encourage Adam and Eve to go against what's there as their rule of existence that God had given to them. So Eve listened and took of the fruit and shared with Adam, and they went against God. And so immediately upon eating the fruit of good and evil, they realized they were naked, and they hid, they were ashamed. And at that very moment, sin entered the story of humankind and continues to impact humankind for duration. So God came to the Garden of Eden and called out for Adam. And Adam didn't respond right away. And he was hiding for the very first time. And of course, God knew where Adam was. But Adam was ashamed and he was hiding because he knew that there was a break in that relationship and that there was a gap there. After dialogue and realizing what is coming to truth of what truly happened, God knew this was all playing out. Between the serpent and Adam and Eve, there was a curse. Because where there's sin, there's death. God told the serpent that he would now have to crawl on the ground, and that one day he'd be crushed by the seed of the woman. For the woman, he cursed her with difficult labor, childbearing. And for Adam, well, he cursed him with the hard work of toil. When he would work the fields, it would be difficult. The ground would be hard, and that it would be difficult for him to work. And that's through all the ages. So at that point, sin has entered mankind. So we see that from here forward, that sin would plague mankind. But God didn't abandon Adam and Eve at that point. He actually gave them skins of animals in order to clothe them, and pulled them out of the Garden of Eden. And they were pulled out. As Adam and Eve had children, Cain and Abel, you've probably heard the story that Cain and Abel were their two sons, and Abel was godly, and Cain simply was not. And Cain had a jealousy thing. And this is again one of the first times that we see sin really transpire to the point of death, and Cain kills his brother Abel, and mostly out of jealousy. We'll see death and death and death continue to be the result of this sin through the story of Scripture. Well, as mankind continued, God never gives up on his people. And he always finds somebody that he can use in order to keep and restore a relationship to him. And so the next point that we see in the story in Genesis is that he finds a man that's trustworthy, and his name is Noah. And he's faithful, he's prayerful, He sees God as the one God, the Almighty God. But God knew that there was a problem among the land, and he had to actually bring forth a flood in order to wipe out all of mankind. So he asked Noah to build an ark. In the ark, his instructions were to bring 2 of every kind of animal, to bring Noah and his sons and their wives aboard. And what he would do is he floods the entire world. And the only survivors at that point were the ones aboard the ark. So Noah sends out a pigeon, and time again, he finally comes to the point and realizes that there is water receding somewhere because there's land, because he came back in his bill, an olive leaf. And he was glad, he knew that existence would be coming in.
All this is in Genesis?
This is all early Genesis.
Wow.
So what happens after that is that when he finally lands and the water subsides, that he was given the command to multiply. And so that's exactly what Noah did. And the families completely multiplied. And they scattered among the earth into the regions that they were. But the problem still existed from the early issue of sin. The early plague of sin was continued in their hearts. And so, unfortunately, even though Noah was faithful and a godly man, the family continued to go in and out of time where they would be faithful to God and serving God. The men, these people all spoke the same language, and they all kind of gathered together, and they decided that they wanted to make their name great. And they built a tower to the heavens. And as they continued to build this tower, it's called the Tower of Babel, they wanted to make their name great. But that was missing the point of what God demands for his name to be great. And so what he did at the Tower of Babel is he divided all of the people at that time. And he destroyed the tower, he changed all of their languages. And so none of them could understand each other. And he scattered them through the earth. So that the men of that time would not be the ones that needed to be great. Because it was only as simple as to worship God, their creator, the only creator. But as we said, God always continues to use men, people, in order to magnify his glory. And he can always find a way in order to restore his relationship to mankind. So in enters Abram, who later becomes Abraham. So he was a faithful man. And Abram was just an absolute godly man. And God made a covenant with Abraham. And we call it the Abrahamic covenant. And this covenant, or this promise, was an unconditional promise. And because Abraham was so godly and so righteous, that he made a promise to Abraham that he would hold forever. He promised him a land. He promised him a people. And he promised him many blessings. And those 3 things were just unconditional promises that he would keep regardless. So at the time, Abraham and his wife were actually quite old. And God told him, as many as the numbers of stars will be the number of your people. And he just couldn't see it because he said, well, I'm an old man. We can't. Well, my wife is barren. And eventually, Abraham had children. And through the descendants of Abraham, of Isaac, and then Joseph, the blessing continued. So fast forward that through this nations, all of these things are happening, and the people, the common problem still continues, right? So the common problem was sin that entered mankind. And that continued with mankind in and out throughout the whole entire story of Scripture. So to bring you to the story of Isaac and then Joseph, his son, Joseph had brothers, but Joseph was the chosen son, and he was favored. And the interesting part of the story is that his brothers knew that he was favored. They didn't like that. So they brought him out to the desert. And they actually left him for dead. They didn't kill him, but they left him for dead because they were tired of and jealous of the father seeing Joseph as a chosen child, as a golden child. And so Joseph later was found by some others and thrown into prison. And he found himself in Egypt. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had him in prison. And Joseph was able to, through God's will, actually decipher some dreams. And he found favor from Pharaoh. And he worked his way up through God's grace, through his hand, through Pharaoh, and he got to the point where he had so much favor that he was put in charge of much of Egypt. Well, famine grew across the land, and at the point where his brothers needed to get resources. And so, in order to get those resources, they had to journey, and they finally found themselves in front of Joseph. And Joseph, they didn't recognize Joseph at first, and his brothers were surprised. They were pleading Joseph that they needed something, grain. They needed provision in order to bring back to the family. And over a few things that happened, Joseph finally revealed himself, and they were afraid. And he told them not to worry, that he was going to take care of them. And so Joseph was able to do that. And it shows continuously that God is using his people in order to show amazing grace to mankind. Well, as we go further into the Bible, there's a point where they're all in Egypt, and as they were growing in numbers, that the Pharaoh became concerned that these Israelites were growing in number. They were obvious that they were Israelites, and he was getting a little bit worried that he was going to lose control of Egypt. And so he sent a demand across the nation that the firstborn of all the Israelite babies that were out there would need to be killed. Well, there was one baby named named Moses, that was held aside. And Moses' mother didn't want Moses to be killed. So she sent him off in a basket and put him down the river. And the daughter of Pharaoh, the king, found the baby and took her in to the palace as her own. And the interesting part of that is that Moses' mother was actually hired as a servant to assist Pharaoh's daughter in order to raise Moses. And so he was actually raised in order to know who God was and to worship God. As he had grown, he decided to leave and go out into the wilderness. And God caught his attention with a burning bush. He called Moses and said, "You can't flee, you can't run, you need to go back." Because the people, the Israelites, were at risk. And those people needed to be set free. So he went back, told Pharaoh that you've got to set my people free. And Pharaoh wasn't having it at first, but after several plagues across the nation, Pharaoh finally released all the Israelites. Because don't forget the promise that he would have a land, he would have a nation of people in worldwide blessing. And that's important to remember through the covenant God that we have. So finally, during the final plague, Pharaoh just says, that's it. I'm not going to, go ahead and leave. And so off goes Moses and all of his people, and they go to leave Egypt to go for the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham. And the last minute, as Moses has already left, Pharaoh felt like, what am I doing? Have I been fooled? And he was kind of questioned by some of his men. So Pharaoh goes and sends his armies after the Israelites. And as they go out, as they approach the Red Sea, the army was coming in behind him. And miraculous God continues his works. In the very right time, he splits the sea, the deep, wide, expansive Red Sea, lets them all cross, the Israelites. And as the Egyptian soldiers try to capture them and try to enter through, the waters begin to pour again and flood out the entire army. It enters in all of the Israelites into the wilderness. And the purpose of this was for them to go after the land of promise. And as they were in the wilderness, Moses went to the mount and he prayed and he spent time with God, and God gave him the law. And he said, you're a people, basically they were a people without a land. And they were out in the wilderness, and these people without a land, they were just trying to figure it out. As I was saying before, we're going in and out of faithfulness to God, who God is. And you've got a people going after the land of promise, but they don't have a land, they don't have a law. And when Moses went up and spent time with God, God gave him the law. And that's the Ten Commandments, the tablets. And when Moses came back to his people in the wilderness, he found out that they were no longer worshiping just the one God, the true Creator. That they started to worship idols, things like that. He was upset, broke tablets, and again, they were in a position where they had to get to the promised land. So as they approached closer to the promised land, he sent in 12 men to look at the Canaanites, to evaluate the promised land, because they had to overtake the promised land as God has promised them. As the 12 men came back, 10 of them said, can't do it. There's no way. The soldiers, the Canaanites, they were too big, they were too tall, they were giants. There was no way they were going to get in. But 2 of them were willing to actually to move forward and to make it work. And that was 2 men that were willing to do it. But 10, the numbers just weren't there, and the Israelites voted not to do it. So God commanded them, do another lap, continue 40 years through the wilderness. And they did a census in the book of Numbers. We see the census that was done, and they took number of all those men and all the people and counted out all the citizens of the Israelites. And over time, 40 years, what happened is the entire generation got purged of the ones that were too afraid to go. And the fear was basically a lack of faithfulness that God promised them that land. So 40 years go through, and Joshua's in control and leading these men, and they lead them into the land of promise. And they take over the Canaanites, and they take over the land. So now they are truly fulfilling the prophecy or the promise the covenant God gave to Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant of a people, a land, and a nation. And the Mosaic covenant still is in play here, because that's the law that these people will live by. And it wasn't anything but a way in order for them to understand how to love God and how to love one another and how to treat each other well. And that's the rule of mankind, ultimately, to live in peace and harmony. But over time, they go in and out of this, and they go through a period of judges. And so they're in this land, and they have a bunch of judges. They're kind of like a military group of people, right, that would decide whether or not these people are living by the law or not. And some judges were good, some were not good. And over time, what happened is that the judges, the people started complaining about the judges. And of course, you have the same thread of sin through mankind. So there's sacrificial things that we find out of the book of Leviticus, and they're learning how to do sacrifices because God is holy, and that the only way for them to be in a relationship, true relationship to God, is for their purity. But that would only last for so long. So if they were to sacrifice an animal, that relationship would only last for so long. So then they'd have to go and sacrifice the animal again. And this was always a cleansing. And the reason why we had that sacrifice is because when there's sin, there's death. And we'll see that continuously. So going through the judges, people got tired of the judges, and they started to ask for a king. Well, there's a man, Samuel, that was given the ability to be, he was a prophet, and he was a deliverer of message from God. And the people continued to ask for a king, which really kind of broke God's heart, because he wanted to be the king, and that would be enough. And if they would just follow the law and see God as king, they would have that strong relationship. But we know from sinful man wasn't able to do that. So Samuel, as they continue to go, so God said, fine, it's okay to anoint. And the first king they anointed was Saul. And King Saul was actually a really good man. He was he played the role, right? He was big, he was a strong guy, a lot of people followed him. He was courageous, he was everything the king should be, and he was a godly man. But he didn't really stay to that, because he was a fallen man as well. And so what happened there, he had a son, Jonathan, and he had a relationship with this David. Well, you've probably heard the story of David. And David was, he had three brothers through the line of Ruth, and David, he was a young guy, and you probably heard the story of David and Goliath, right? So the way the story was told is that under Saul's leadership as the king, and he was the king of the people, from the people, by the people, he was good, but not so great. David, they were in battle with the Palestinians. And what happened was that David heard that his brothers needed to get some supplies, and so he was going to bring supplies out to his brothers at the front line. And when he got out there, he heard that the Goliath was out there and he was scaring everybody. He was just this big, enormous giant, and he would yell down over the valley of Elah, "Hey, send us who you got, who's next?" And he would just kind of mock the Israelites. And so David went back and he said, this whole Goliath thing it's out of control. I want to go out